funnel model is highly flawed. This idea of there is this funnel that you're like pushing people through or nurturing people through is really flipped on its head a little bit. Like it's more about the value to the business versus the value to customers. What words customers say is very different than what they mean. And it is very easy to conflate the two. And I'm worried for teams that are taking demo call transcripts and using AI and thinking that is insight. That is not insight. That is copy. It's voice of customer, but it is not meaning. Companies are investing in growth without having a foundational understanding of who their customers are.
Hey, welcome to the Message Market Fit podcast. I'm your host, Chris Silvestri, and if you're new here, this is a show where I chat with B2B SaaS folks in marketing, product, growth, and founders about how they join the conversation already happening in their customers' minds. We dive deep into their thinking, their systems, and their playbooks to see how they empathize with their audience and speak to them in a way that resonates, so they're compelled to take action. Join us and learn how you too can shape your messaging strategy and write copy that truly resonates and differentiates you. I'm super excited about my guest today, Georgiana Laudi. Gia is the co-founder and CEO at Forget the Funnel, where she works with B2B SaaS teams to dig into customer insight and use it to help them grow. In this episode, we chat about Gia's journey from early digital marketing to founding Forget the Funnel, why companies should move beyond the traditional funnel model, how to operationalize customer research across teams, and much more. Let's dive right in.
Hey, Gia, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm great. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So I would say for listeners who don't know about you and what you do, can you walk us through some of your background first?
Background? Yes. So I started in marketing in the very, very early 2000s, and I was doing the quintessential digital marketing, SEO, started in the early days, like social media, conversion rate optimization, which I didn't know had that name until years later, overall web marketing, again, in the early 2000s, eventually I was working for the family business, for my father's business, which was e-commerce, as a retail florist, but I was very focused on the e-commerce side of the business, which was at the time the fourth most purchased thing on the internet behind like books and porn and that. So I learned a lot about SEO and optimization and web marketing because we had to. It was a very competitive space. And then eventually I went agency side of things, I had a little stint there, didn't love working at agencies, but I did learn a ton. And then eventually I was independent freelancer for a little while, helping all kinds of businesses, mostly small SMB businesses with their web marketing. And then I eventually went in-house and I was in-house as VP marketing at Unbounce for 5 years. And then I went independent again. And I've been doing that ever since, although there's been a few iterations. So I originally started out as a consulting and advisory, and I was really doing weekly calls with teams and heads of marketing and heads of product marketing. And then Claire and I formed Forget the Funnel. And now we do, at Forget the Funnel, we work with B2B SaaS teams on these sort of very tightly run, I'll call them research projects, but really they go way beyond research. They're really about leveraging customer insight for growth, predominantly in like a PLG environment. But really we are focused on customer-led growth because whatever model works for your customers is the one you should be leveraging. And PLG is our favorite sandbox to play in, but that's what we're doing these days.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm curious. Can you tell why you moved from in-house to independent? Because that's a question that a lot of people ask me as well. I used to work in an agency for some time and then I went on my own. So what was your reason?
That's it. I did all the iterations, like worked for the family business. And then I went independent as just a pure freelancer. Like I considered myself a freelancer. And then I went in-house. I can tell you why both sides. So as a freelancer, I have I guess because I learned to operate as an owner when I was working in the family business. I thought like an owner. I worked like an owner. And so when I was freelancing, I was getting to the point of being always overbooked, which was a good problem to have, but I was overworking and I found myself spread a bit thin across multiple clients. And so I thought, how wonderful would it be to completely invest myself in one brand? And so it was amazing to go in-house. I don't regret that experience at all. It was wonderful. I met amazing people. I went from being the only person who knew what I was talking about to learning so much from my peers in that environment. So that I really did get a ton out of working in-house. However, at a certain point, I felt the limitations of where I could go. And by the way, this whole time I'm still operating like an owner because that's just
Mm.
my mode of working. I take a ton of like ownership and accountability and
Yeah.
I just sort of operate like an owner. I've got an entrepreneur sort of mindset for better or for worse. And so I knew that eventually I was going to go back independent and it was time. I had just had my second kid. I had been there for 5 years. It was time for me to evolve back into
Yeah.
entrepreneurship, which I knew I would get back to anyway.
Yeah.
And that was
Awesome.
like 8 years ago, actually, now.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So forget the funnel. Can you tell people what's the philosophy behind it? Why should people forget the funnel?
Yeah. This is true of all businesses, but particularly for recurring revenue businesses, the funnel model is highly flawed. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir talking to you about this, but inherently, this idea of there is this funnel that you're like pushing people through or nurturing people through is really flipped on its head a little bit. Like it's more about the value to the business versus the value to customers. And when you've built your business around a recurring revenue model, building a relationship, a long-standing, high LTV, high mutually beneficial relationship with customers, thinking about your relationship with them as a funnel is highly problematic and has nothing to do with LTV and retention and them sticking around and getting a ton of value and like loyalty. Yeah, really, it was just, I think inherently most people understand that a funnel is a flawed model. But what do you do instead is what we're begging people to do, right? Which is think about their relationship with customers as a relationship. Think about their relationship with customers in the context in which your customer is in, not the business, the context in which they're experiencing the pain that you solve, the context in which they're in when they're evaluating you as a solution, the context they're in when they are achieving value or solving their job to be done, the context in which when they're an existing customer and looking to their next challenges and next opportunities, and really having that understanding of where your customer is in their relationship with you is very counter the funnel model. And so that's
Yeah.
what we're about, is helping companies understand the context in all of those on all of those stages of your relationship with your customer.
I don't know if you're familiar or you've ever stumbled on Mac Labs, and the founder, I think, is Flint McLaughlin, I think, and he talks about the inverted funnel, which is basically rather than having a lot of people go to the funnel and a few out, you basically
Mm-hmm.
learn so much about customers that you only let the right ones in, and basically
Totally.
gets you more like better results on the other hand.
100%. I think far too many teams, and I say holistically, not just marketing, but teams on the whole, are spreading themselves too thin and don't have a deep enough understanding of who their ideal customers are. And they end up targeting too many, and then everything falls flat. The performance-wise, things fall flat because they're not focused in enough on those high-value customers.
So with customer-led growth, is that what you mean? Understanding customers and then letting your data lead your actions?
Yes. So customer-led growth is really based on the idea that, yes, you need to deeply understand your customers, but everybody says talk to your customers, we hear that all the time. It's very easy to say, it's a very different thing to do. And
Mm.
even more importantly, what we see teams do over and over again is conduct customer research poorly, or even if it's done well, they don't operationalize around it. They don't mobilize the team around the learnings. It's like just information being thrown over to the fence to this team to take little bits and pieces of, but it's not operationalized in a way that the team can really leverage it and think about the leading indicators of success that tell us that our customers have reached moments of value that really influence those lagging indicators of success. So it's about operationalizing customer insight. So yes, the foundational customer research, super, super important to do, but none of that matters unless your team can actually take action around it. And that is where we see the majority of teams really drop the ball.
Yeah. Do you see customer-led growth helpful for any type of companies? Because of one thing that I'm wondering, and I was wondering when I stumbled on your content and everything you write about,
Mhm.
it's what about early stage companies who don't really have a lot of customers, maybe that don't even have customers? How can they
Yeah.
do it?
Yeah. Sorry. The way I originally was thinking you were asking that question was like, does this apply in a non-recurring revenue situation? To which the answer is yes. It is
Yeah.
particularly advantageous for recurring revenue. However, to your actual question, which is what do you do? How do you leverage customer-led growth if you don't have any customers yet? So I would say that you can still leverage it. You can still capture customer insight even if you don't have customers, right? There's a lot of different styles of research that you can leverage. Obviously, the companies that this is maybe not obvious, but the companies that we work with predominantly are those that have happily paying customers and they're trying to get to the next level of growth. They're trying to figure out, how do I scale this thing? How do I leverage product-led growth in my situation in order to grow this thing effectively and efficiently because they've gotten some sort of traction or product market fit or whatever you want to call it thus far. That's the majority of the situations that when we're in with companies, they do have happily paying customers that we can learn from. But you can absolutely apply this to a company who does not yet have those customers just by leveraging the same type of research. You would just be doing it a little bit more hypothesis based on an audience that you are creating a proxy understanding around. This is going to be my target market, or this is my initial understanding of who my target market is going to be. Still doing that jobs to be done research with that group, but you're treating it a little bit more like a hypothesis versus in a situation where you already have some customers to learn from. You can feel a lot more confident in the results, obviously, because these people they've actually made a decision to choose your product. They've put money where their mouth is. They've reached value. They can describe the pain. They can describe the decision-making process. They can describe the value they now experience. So it's a more validated sort of way of doing research that you
Yeah.
can feel a little bit more confident about. But you've got to start somewhere. And a lot of companies just out of the gate are like, we want to do this right. We like, sometimes it's like second time or third time founders. They remember what it was like in the early days and they know that it's easier to make decisions based on real customer data. So it's absolutely something that can be done. You just have to be careful who you're learning from and
Yeah.
how you
Yeah. Makes
interpret
sense.
what they say. It's
Yeah.
a little bit of a different style of research, but it's still totally valid for operationalizing their experience and building measures of success around that experience.
Yeah. And once you get the first customers, then you can take all that and iterate and learn more and improve,
Totally.
right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the companies that we work with, I'd say I want to say about half of them, sorry, let me rephrase that. I Every company that we work with, part of the sort of goal of working together is not only to get the sort of foundational learning and customer insight and operationalizing it, it's to build the muscle internally. So a lot of the companies that we work with and the teams that we work with will come back to us 6 months later or a year later and say, we want to do it again. The other half have built that muscle now. They've seen what good looks like to conduct this type of thing. They know how to iterate and continue to validate those foundational resources that we built together. And so this is definitely an iterative thing. I would never say that this is not a set it and forget it. That can't be the reality. Products and markets change way too quickly for that. But it's absolutely, depending on how, quickly your product iterates and what your product roadmap looks like. Yeah, you might want to do this type of thing like every twice a year or once annually or more, depending on, again, your
Mm.
product roadmap and the market.
Yeah. Yeah. You're basically teaching them to fish so that they can do it themselves.
That's right. Somebody once referred to us as a liberating force, not an occupying
Ah,
force.
good.
And I don't like the war analogy of it, but that's definitely how we see ourselves is it's a muscle that not everybody comes into companies with this type of skill set and having these foundational resources in place, these like jobs to be done that we've identified in their customers and the customer experience map and KPIs and what people are thinking, feeling, and doing at each of these milestones, that is a resource that can be built on for years. And so it's a muscle that many folks, especially in earlier stage companies, just don't show up to the company with because they have specialized skills and other.
Yeah. Yeah. From what you are seeing with your clients, what's one thing that you're seeing that they still don't know about? Because what I'm seeing is a lot of companies already know about what type of research they might do. They know about like voice of customer, maybe writing
That's
copy,
been your experience?
messaging. Yes, some companies know. So
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
and
That has
maybe
not been my experience.
it's actually probably like the old way of like the more enterprisey way of seeing voice of customer is like this initiative that basically informs the company. But what's one thing that you're seeing that they don't know, like the thing that they most don't know about from your experience?
I think the biggest mistake that I'm seeing teams make right now is doubling down on marketing when they do not know who their customer is. I'm seeing a lot of wasted marketing spend, unfortunately, because there's a lot of pressure to grow. There's a lot of reasons for this, right? And the reasons are different at varying stages of a company's maturity. Sometimes it's because the marketing team has to hit targets, and their targets are related to signups or trial starts or demo calls booked. And so their mandate is increase that number and hit a certain target month over month. And so they become laser focused on this metric that at the end of the day may not be influencing revenue for the business, but because they are measured, their success is measured by this one particular metric of like signups on the website or trial starts or demos booked, that little piece, that their one little piece of the pie is not communicating to the rest and isn't actually having the downstream impact that was originally envisioned by giving them that target. So I see that happen. And then I also see scenarios where heads of product or product executives or founders are focused on growth, and they look to the product and product levers to grow the business without the insight into what led somebody to seek out their solution to begin with. What is the context that person is in? What solution are they firing in order to hire this solution? So they're not thinking enough like marketers, and so marketers aren't thinking enough like product managers, and product managers aren't thinking enough like marketers, and or founders aren't thinking enough. Sometimes they sway one way or the other. But in general, I would say the biggest problem, there's a lot of problems. It would be easy. It would be easy to point to, many things, but I think inherently the biggest issue that I'm seeing happen right now is companies are investing in growth without having a foundational understanding of who their customers are. They're spending tons of money, they're hiring, they're trying all kinds of things, they're A/B testing, they develop hypotheses, they're trying to validate, they're looking at the data and they're digging into the analytics, and they're doing what they believe is all the right things, but they're missing the forest for the trees because they haven't actually zoomed in on, and they don't actually have a solid enough understanding of who it is that they're serving, the context in which that these people make a decision. I know that you've had a number of people talk about jobs to be done on the podcast, so I won't go into jobs to be done, but the sort of learnings that you get by doing that type of research, I'm going to say either 10 times out of 10, companies think they know who their customers are, and pretty well every team that we've worked with has learned something new about their customers that they didn't realize, and crystallized their understanding around who that ideal customer is, and therefore was able to crystallize and focus and prioritize their work to move the needle in ways that actually influence revenue at the end of the day and LTV, right? Because as increasing the sign up, your conversion rate on your website is all fine and good, but if those aren't turning into high LTV customers, the conversion rate on your website might as well have dipped. So that's often a conversation that I'm having with teams is, we can talk about increasing the conversion rate on your website, but if it's not actually turning into high value paying customers, that's not the measure of success for your website. It's actually activation. It's trial to paid or free to paid.
Yeah.
conversion.
So when it comes to jumping into all those projects, what kind of red flags do you look for? Do you look for those metrics to understand whether or not they are doing things right?
Generally, when we are starting a conversation with companies, they know that something is off. They
Yeah.
know they should be performing better than they are. And they generally have sometimes we know a lot of things are wrong and we're not sure which is the biggest issue of ours. And by learning from their customers and then doing, I don't like to call it this, but like kind of the secret shopper thing where we literally we learn from customers, we identify the jobs to be done. We decide with them which job to be done are we going to prioritize, because generally we identify 2 or 3 jobs to be done across the customer base. And then we have to prioritize which one, because if we serve all of them, our messaging is going to continue to fall flat. So we focus on one, we prioritize one, and then wearing the hat of that customer with that job to be done, we go through marketing, we go through the website, we go through the sign-up experience, we go through the product onboarding, we go through hitting what we believe is value realization for that, because we've learned that about that customer. We go through that entire customer experience and we can identify all of the ways that customer experience and that product experience is out of alignment with that ideal customer. So it becomes shooting fish in a barrel, because it's so obvious at that point where the customer and product experience is out of alignment with ideal customers that it is literally just a matter of identifying those opportunities and then prioritizing them. And we use
Yeah.
benchmark data to figure that out too. So we always ask for some benchmark data when we start working with a company to see, are they way off? Benchmark data only goes so far, right? The best benchmark is your own product experience. And we're looking for a lift across the board. But in general, we can see, if activation rates are like really low, well, we're going to spend some extra attention there. Or if retention was worrisome, then we'll spend extra space there. Or if sign-up rates are lower than they should be for that market, then we'll spend extra attention there. But in general, it becomes real obvious. It's just really getting to the heart of who are these ideal customers. And I think that many teams, they understand inherently they should be doing customer research, but their customer research is so piecemeal. They're listening to sales calls of people who never converted into a sale. And even if they are listening to the sales calls of people who converted into a sale, they're treating them, all of them, equally, even though they may have inherently completely different business models or jobs to be done or needs. And so there's no real way to leverage the research for actual revenue growth. It's just all inputs are created equally. It's like the adage of the squeaky wheel gets the, what is
Gets
it?
the grease.
Squeaky wheel gets the oil. Yeah.
It gets the grease.
It gets the grease. That's right. And I've seen a lot of teams make that mistake where the customers that they hear from, they're like, oh, this is our customer. This is our customer. No, actually, your best customers are the ones you don't hear from. So you've been over-indexing for these squeaky wheel customers. And that has happened, I can't even tell you how many times we've worked with teams where they think their customer is one group, and actually it's this like quiet majority sitting over here that is actually driving all their revenue. That happens a lot. And that's, I would say that is probably the biggest mistake that we're seeing teams make, is knowing that research is important, but not having the skill set internally to do it well, and the learnings are lost.
So for identifying this ideal customer, what would you recommend them looking at? Your other CRM? What else?
So general, when we work with, generally one of our first conversations that we have with them is, who is the list of customers that you would clone? So think about them from the perspective of, they inherently understand the value that you provide. They were not hard to close. They are actively engaged in your product today. And they signed up not so long ago that they don't remember what life was like before. So with that criteria, and sometimes there's a couple other variables, but generally we're looking for that group of customers to learn from. And then we're running interviews, but they are like ACE interviews. Something that has happened a couple of times too is, we've done customer interviews. We'll send you the customer interviews that we did. And then we get the customer interviews and we're like, really sorry. Like we're so happy that you took the time to interview your customers, but unfortunately these are not usable. And there's a plethora of reasons I probably don't need to go into with you, but there's a lot of ways that teams mess up customer research and it ultimately ends up being not usable. So what we would say, we take all the inputs because any learnings is good. But once we have that segment, then we would run jobs interviews with them. We reach pattern saturation, Generally, that's 10 to 12 interviews.
Mm.
If this is a lower ACV type of product with a larger customer base, which we've done quite a bit of too, we'll start with qualitative surveys in order to pre-qualify for interviews. We've also gone the other way around. But in general, that's what we would do is it's rooted really in those conversations. We use a couple of methods to
Yeah.
have those conversations, and we identify the jobs to be done, and then we prioritize one, and then we operationalize it, like I was describing
Nice.
before.
When you say
That's our
pre-qualify for,
process. Yeah.
when you say pre-qualify for service, you mean that basically in the survey you ask a question, hey, would you be interested in getting on a call? Is that what you mean?
Well, so yes, that's definitely part of it. But again, a couple of examples, like we work with a couple of companies that have hundreds of thousands and even millions of customers. And in situations like that, there has to be a way to narrow down the group of customers that you're going to learn from. You're not going to run 100 interviews. That is a waste of time. You're not going to learn anything with 100 interviews. I've worked on some projects where even with qualitative surveys, after about 100 high quality qualitative survey responses, the pattern saturation, you reach it within 25, 50 responses. But it is important to, when you are talking about a customer base that's that big, which is not every SaaS company, obviously, but in situations like that, it can be very useful to run a qualitative survey. What I mean by qualitative is I'm not talking multiple choice here, but a qualitative survey asking them to self-identify, asking open text field, capturing a little bit of voice of customer so that you're not unfairly or inadvertently or unintentionally biasing their responses in any way. And then once you get those responses, yes, you're asking for the opportunity to get on a call with them, but the pre-qualifier is really, does this person actually qualify to speak to? Is this somebody that we want to replicate? Is this the type of customer we would want more of? And generally, we can get to the answers pretty straightforward. With 50, again, high quality qual survey responses, we can see, okay, these are the types of customers that we want to talk to more of. And then we identify them in the customer base. Either we reach out to them because they opted in the survey, or we go back to the customer base itself and identify that group of customers and find more of them to have conversations with.
All right. Speaking of research, do you see getting buy-in for research being a big problem for companies? I know that you talked about how lone wolfing research is not a great idea. So what's your perspective on that?
To be honest, no. I think, like I said, look, if I answered this question for you like 10 years ago, the answer would have been, yeah. A lot of founders were like, just more leads, help us get more leads. And that's all that it's about. I think these days, companies, leadership at SaaS companies have wisened up and they recognize that the cost of acquisition is astronomically higher than it was even 5 years ago. And I think that inherently, especially product leadership and executives understand that the return on investment in marketing is just not what it used to be. And if you can optimize the rest of your customer's experience and optimize your activation rates and your retention rates, that is going to serve marketing a whole lot better. Also, this type of research, it serves marketing and product. So marketing will reap the benefits of this type of research happening just as much as product will. So anyways, all to say, these days, we don't get any pushback because I think that teams understand and leadership understands that they are wasting their time if they are not deeply understanding their customers, especially if they're in a commoditized market. It is particularly important to understand what your differentiated value is, and taking a guess and just positioning against your competitors is not enough. And in order to really understand your competitive advantages, the answers are inside your best customers' heads. You just got to pull them out and operationalize them for your team. So that's the other thing too, is like, we know what got us here isn't going to get us there. And if they keep doing the same things, they're just going to get the same results. And so a lot of, I think, SaaS founders in particular, like product owners and product managers, they understand that there's a level of rigor that's needed to get to the next level of growth. And they know we need alignment across the organization on who it is that we're serving.
Yeah, speaking of that alignment, I know that you wrote a bit about how customer-led growth also benefit teams, which I found super interesting. Can you dive into that?
Yeah. So it's really around, again, it goes back to this customer insight is great, but if all you're doing is sharing, we learned this from this customer this week, and I'm not saying that having a conversation with a customer and then sharing the outcomes of that conversation with the rest of your team isn't useful. It absolutely is. But it in aggregate, right? And having a sort of aggregate understanding of who your ideal customers are and operationalizing how your team works around that is much more valuable. Again, anecdotal insight, cool. It's great. And it definitely does a lot for getting more buy-in on the type of research because sometimes you learn something new. You talk to founders and they're like,
Mm.
oh, this conversation happened. I'd never heard this before. I never thought of that before. That was a real aha moment. And that's all well and good. But if you can't take that learning and operationalize and section your team around it, it's not going to lead to the type of growth that you're looking for. And so what we do is we take that customer experience, what we learn in the jobs to be done research, what we learn in the sort of analysis and heuristic of the customer and product experience, and we create a customer experience map. I don't call it a customer journey map deliberately because a lot of people have a lot of connotations around customer journey maps. They think of like website, sign up, like it's not often for recurring revenue businesses. It's often very transactional. That people start talking about MQLs and SQLs, don't get me started. And it is a very business serving. And so we are trying to flip it and say it's your customer's experience from before they know that you exist all the way through to screaming your name from the mountaintops. That entire length, that entire customer experience is what we operationalize for teams. And what we're doing is identifying the sort of leaps of faith and the moments of value that your customer experiences, not the business, your customer. And those are, if we can identify those milestones, what people are thinking, feeling, doing at each of those milestones, then we can also come up with a measure of success that helps us and the team know we've helped our customer get to this moment of value with this KPI. And these are leading indicators of success that ultimately influence your lagging indicators of success, like child to paid conversion and revenue and all of that stuff. So that's what we do for teams is help them understand where those moments of value are for customers and the context in which a customer is in so that teams can say, okay, I'm focused on helping customers get to first value. I know that this is what they're thinking, feeling, and doing when they're trying to get to first value. So I know to protect them from it. We don't send them our newsletter. We don't send them our
Mm.
blog. We're not talking to them. We're not throwing the kitchen sink at them. We're only trying to help them get to first value. And so teams can stay laser focused on that KPI, that leading indicator of success that tells us that our customer has gotten to first value. And that applies to the customer experience maps looks different for every product, but that applies to a value realization stage, a continued value stage, a value growth stage, again, because we're talking about
Mm.
recurring value. So really understanding these milestones, putting measures of success in place, and then taking the reins off the team and letting them basically do whatever they want to do with this information now, with this deep understanding and with this measure of success. There's a lot more freedom for them to be strategic and make way more informed decisions about how to influence those KPIs.
Yeah.
So teams love it. Like every time we run one of these workshops, there's people like nodding along. Thank God you said this. I've been thinking this for so long, and you're actually like, you're saying it now. And that happens a lot, especially for product managers and heads of marketing and even heads of success are like, oh yes, that is
It's
exactly
freeing.
what
Yeah.
it's so freeing. And they're so happy. And I've talked to a couple of founders after we've done our workshops with teams and they're like, you did more in 2.5 weeks than my product manager did in a year and a half. And nobody's happier than him. It is a really cool experience and it's super gratifying. Like selfishly, it's super gratifying for us because it's a huge unlock for teams.
Yeah. So how do you go from this experience map to an actual messaging document or messaging guide? And what do you include in this messaging guide?
Yeah. So our messaging guides are very strategic in nature. They're related to the customer experience map, but they are separate. So I would say that the messaging guides that we produce are generally focused on that high level value that the product provides. And so you would think about leaning into it generally in the sort of struggle phase and evaluation phase. Typically, we see messaging strategies shift on the growth side. So like post-acquisition, your messaging strategy would shift slightly because people's goals change, right? You've solved their initial job to be done, and then they've got new challenges, new opportunities to pursue. So in general, our messaging guides are focused on that first struggle phase when somebody is experiencing pain and the evaluation phase. What we do is we do value mapping based on the conversations and the patterns that we saw emerge in conversations. We literally map what customers say is important to them to the specific parts of the product that deliver that value. And that is a process that we can't do from top to bottom without the subject matter experts in the room with us. So that is part of our workshop generally with the team. Somebody from engineering, somebody from product, somebody from CS, somebody from sales, somebody from marketing, the leadership, having those folks in the room and really helping them understand what we call sort of the value themes. So what are the value themes that showed up in those conversations? And now let's talk about the parts of your product that deliver that value. We can come up with some guesses, but in general, it's a conversation that we have with the team to really dig into what are those specific product attributes, features, feature families that deliver that value. So we just call it value mapping essentially.
Yeah.
And we use that value mapping exercise to guide our messaging strategy and also guide that value map influences the messaging, but it also influences the onboarding experience we might recommend or the heuristic, the hierarchy of messaging on a website or a features page. It can also influence pricing strategy. Not that's our specialty, but it can influence pricing and packaging. So that value mapping exercise is good for a lot of purposes, but one of the outcomes of that value mapping exercise is a messaging guide.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think about the link between value mapping and positioning? So, for example, if a company comes to you and says, "Oh, we just did this repositioning exercise, and now we want to turn it into messaging," where do you step in, and what do you do?
That's really interesting. It depends on how good the positioning work was.
Let's say April Danforth did it.
So if they've worked with April, then our job is much easier. And we will basically run research and run that messaging strategy anchored in that positioning that was identified for various reasons. Partly because it's the direction that the company wants to go in. Partly it's because that's what the market needs. Partly it's because of the competitive landscape. There's a lot of reasons for landing on a specific positioning. Generally, we're not trying to reposition a company. Generally, we're focused on re-messaging. Sometimes there's some repositioning, but we're mostly focused on, you've got a group of customers that get a ton of value out of you today. How could you do a better job of not only describing what you do to these potential customers, but also helping those customers reach moments of value in their relationship with you so that you can increase conversion rates, not just on your website, but in your product and ultimately lead to higher LTV. So that's really, we're not trying to reposition companies. We try to re-message companies and also provide them with a framework to help with product onboarding, value realization, and value growth. We really think of ourselves as product marketing in that way, if that makes sense. And so sometimes, if a company is really poorly positioned, that's going to come out. We'll end up finding that in the research. Ideally, they've worked with somebody like April. But in general, the companies that we're working with, they've experienced success and they're now looking to scale it up because again, they know that what got them here isn't going to get them there. And they're looking for that scale and they're looking to increase conversion rate across the customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if that 100% answered your question.
Yeah, sure.
In a roundabout kind of way.
Nice. I didn't want to dive too deep into jobs to be done. We're going to talk a lot about in your podcast, other podcasts, but I have a question that's a bit more specific, which is you talk about how you prioritize for one job to be done, but how do you define a job to be done that's maybe in the ones you're considering, but it's actually something that a company should avoid targeting? What's something that tells you it's just a frequency of mention that's not as mentioned as frequently? What's something that tells you we can totally avoid?
Not at all, actually.
Targeting.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing you ask, and let me know if I've got this right. So once you've identified a couple of jobs to be done in a customer base, how do you prioritize one?
Yeah, basically,
Is that what you mean?
and how you exclude the ones that you shouldn't be focusing on.
Yeah. So it's a really great question. And the answer is completely different with every company that we've worked with. There's no go-to answer. Unfortunately, the
Mhm.
answer is it depends. But I can tell you a couple of scenarios. An example of a company that we worked with not too long ago. I've got a couple of examples in my mind's eye. So
Mhm.
sometimes it's a scenario where we learn from customers and we find that there's two distinct groups, jobs to be done that basically show up. Sometimes there's a straggling third one, but we don't worry about that one too much because the numbers aren't too big and they disqualify themselves. But in
Yeah.
general, let's say there's two that sort of emerge. Every once in a while, there's one. And that's perfect because we're like, okay, Ace, you've done a great job bringing in these customers. Let's optimize your experience now for like actual scale. But in other situations, it's a little muddier and a number of companies that we've worked with, two distinct groups show up. And sometimes it's, oh shit, we really need to disqualify this group because they're draining our customer success. They're driving up our cost of acquisition. They're a pain in the ass to serve. They don't get it. They don't have a high willingness to pay. They don't have a line item on their budget for us. It's like pushing a boulder up a hill. They don't know that they have the problem. There's a lot of reasons to disqualify a group of customers. And so sometimes it's really obvious. And with many of the companies that we work with, unbeknownst to them when they show up, they're actually serving two completely different groups of customers. And the reason why their marketing and their messaging and their onboarding has been falling flat so far is because they've been conflating too big of a group of customers
Mm.
together. And that has happened and it has been dramatic. The impact that has on the team is dramatic because they're like, oh, thank God. We now know who our actual customer is. And it is very different from this homogenous group that they couldn't get a handle on and couldn't crystallize around. In other situations, we identify multiple jobs to be done and they're viable. And the company we could serve all three of these or both of these. And in that situation, what we generally encourage them to do is prioritize one and operationalize around that one and basically start to identify who's showing up through the front door. So I will recommend a segmenting question to identify which group of customers is actually showing up and then provide a more customized experience for them based on their job to be done in their product onboarding, as an example. And then for the other group, send them what you've been doing so far. And then once you've created an onboarding experience, and I'm only focusing on onboarding, but once you've created that for the first job, then if that second job still feels like a priority, which it often does, then you go back and do the same thing. But it's really important that value mapping may not be the same for that group. And so your product onboarding, the messaging you use, your voice of customer is almost always different across two different jobs to be done. So you have to craft. That's like the promise of meaningful segmentation is that right message, right person, right time. That
Yeah.
when you've actually done jobs research, the promise of that meaningful segmentation and actually increasing conversions and providing the right messaging to the right person in the right context is much, much easier. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's we're eliminating one and we have to focus on this. Sometimes it's, okay, we're going to focus on this one for now and we're going to come back and serve this other group after that.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. So I have last two couple questions. So one, it's
Yeah.
what's your hot take on AI? Do you use it? How? I'm pretty curious. I try to ask a lot of people just to see the different use cases.
We have experimented with it. I think it is dangerous for research. I think it's really cool for a lot of things. I use it. I don't want to say I use it daily, but I use it at least weekly to help with like ideation, brainstorm. There's a lot of use cases for it, particularly for messaging, especially if you don't know a lot about a certain industry. We have members of our team that will tap into and use AI like ChatGPT to learn more about industry jargon that they may be
Yeah.
less familiar with. And they pair that with the actual insight and voice of customer in order to develop a messaging strategy or like straight up write copy. That use case is great. Where I see it getting problematic, and I'm seeing a lot of mentions of this, is using AI to analyze transcripts. You cannot measure, and Bob Mesta, I had a conversation with Bob Mesta, with Bob about this. Like, you
Uh-huh.
cannot measure energy. AI
Uh-huh.
cannot measure energy from a transcript. And
Yeah.
so if you are you can rely on transcripts for voice of customer, but you better not be relying on it for meaning. What words customers say is very different than what they mean. And it is
Yeah.
very easy to conflate the two. And I'm worried for teams that are taking demo call transcripts and using AI and thinking that is insight. That is not insight. That is copy. It's voice of customer, but it is not meaning. And
Yeah.
for right now, nothing replaces a human conversation, the ability to ask follow-up questions, the ability to follow a story, understand where the energy is in a conversation. AI cannot do that. AI will not pull the actual meaning out of a conversation. Very helpful for analyzing a transcript for VOC and finding mentions of something in a transcript. Yep. Perfect use case for AI, not for making business critical decisions based on transcripts analyzed by AI. Like, I shudder to think about.
Yeah.
That is so scary to me that
Eh,
people could be making
yeah.
business critical decisions on that, like making decisions about messaging or positioning or anyway. But for copy, 100%. There's a lot of, again, like for copy, yes. For voice of customer, yes. For actual meaning and insight, no.
Especially if you're not the one running the interviews, right? So if you're, say, someone
Oh,
outside that
yeah,
goes and just takes the
exactly.
transcript. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I say transcripts of like support calls or demo calls. Who are they? What's the context that they came in, right? Did they even become a high paying customer? Like, not all customers and not all leads are created equally. It's really important who you prioritize in your learnings and who you operationalize your product experience and your messaging strategy around. Really,
Yeah.
it's 101 when you're marketers
Yes.
know this, right? When you're marketing to everybody, you're marketing to no one. And the same is true with research.
All right. My last question is, what's one thing that you're learning now and where do you usually go to learn?
Oh, great question. What's one thing that I'm learning now? I think I'm on the journey with everybody else, figuring out what ways AI can be leveraged intelligently and in really helpful ways versus potentially detrimental, like I was just talking about. I took an AI, like a no-code AI boot camp in January, which was really
Mm,
cool. That was a lot of fun. It was purely the learner in me. I'm not
yeah.
building a no code app or anything, but still
Yeah.
just like exercising that part of my brain is really interesting. I listen to podcasts, but that's just like general, like staying on top of things. But as far as learning, I would say the thing that I'm learning most about right now is probably the use cases, the responsible use cases for AI. What can
Yeah.
AI do and not do is what I'm learning right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Learning the boundaries and
Yeah.
the extremities.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gia. It's been great, illuminating. So where can people find you? They can find you on their website, forgetthefunnel.com. They can get your book,
Yeah.
Forget the Funnel, LinkedIn maybe, or what else?
Yeah, LinkedIn for sure. I would definitely recommend if the process sounds interesting to you, and then I would definitely recommend checking out the book. Wrote the book because we wanted to empower those that want to DIY it. However, if you are in the situation where you need to move a little bit more quickly, I would say that DIYing it might take you a couple of months. We basically run through this process in a couple of weeks. So we can run research inside of 4 weeks. We can do the whole analysis of your customer experience in 6 weeks, along with that workshop that I was describing. So we have a really well-oiled machine to get this done really quickly. But the book does, if you're curious about the process itself, the book goes through step by step. And there is a 110-page workbook that goes
Mm.
along with the book because we wanted to keep the book very short. So you can read it in an afternoon. That was the goal. Keep the book very short. We took a page, so to speak, from April there. But there is an accompanying workbook that has all kinds of like checklists and worksheets and all kinds of templates and scripts and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. But
Yeah. Highly
LinkedIn,
recommend the book.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah. LinkedIn, I try, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely paying attention. I'm just not always I'm very inconsistent there.
Aren't you tired of being bitch slapped on LinkedIn?
Being
You know what it means? Bitch
no.
slapped is basically when people DM you and the first thing that they do is
Oh
just
boy.
pitching you with something. Yeah,
Yes.
that's kind of gets
It
annoying.
is, yes. It is disheartening and quite hard. And the worst part about it is that, yeah, I'm in this situation where I have so many connection
Yeah,
requests
I
that I
bet. Yeah.
fall behind. And every once in a while, there's like something genuine in there and it
Yeah.
gets lost amongst the garbage.
Uh,
And that's what breaks my heart about LinkedIn is that I'm so like, it's taken me 3 weeks to respond
yeah.
because there's all this other garbage in here. So yeah, I definitely, if anybody is curious, like actually wants to get in touch with me and is realizing LinkedIn might not be the way, it's Gia at Forget the Funnel. For anybody who
That's
wants to
awesome.
connect, just email me. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the pod. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, the best thing you could do to support the show and help me as a small business owner would be to leave a review. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and let me know what you think. If you don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe, and if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, just hit me up on LinkedIn at Christopher Silvestri or Twitter at SilvestriChris. Speak to you next time.